All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you all so much for joining us. This is Left Bank Books welcomes Missouri native author Melissa Scholes Young, who will discuss her new novel, The Hive. Young will be in conversation with award-winning author Joy Castro. Left Bank Books is St. Louis's oldest independent bookstore. We would like to thank all of our supporters, the supporters of Melissa and Joy, and everyone for their outpouring of love for our bookstore. Left Bank Books offers curbside pickup and delivery to anywhere in the country, anywhere in the world. We are very happy to be able to bring our event series virtual. We believe that events are a way to expand your mind and bring in new thoughts to make the world a better place. We hope that you enjoy this event, and we hope that you support Left Bank Books by purchasing a signed copy for you or for all of your friends at left-bank.com. Purchasing a signed copy of the book from Left Bank Books allows us to keep our bookstore and staff operating, and it allows us to keep this event series going. So thank you for your support. I will add that we are now back open to the public, so you can come in and find this brilliant book on our shelves now. And so happy that Melissa was able to sign book plates for us, that we have the ability to offer signed copies right now. I am Shane Mullen. I'm the events coordinator for Left Bank Books. I help produce our hundreds of author events each year with a fantastic team here in St. Louis. We will be taking questions from you, the audience, at the end of the event, towards the end of the hour. So you can type your questions as a comment, and you can do that at any point in time throughout the event. Be sure to follow Left Bank Books on Facebook and YouTube to be notified about all of our fantastic virtual events. Our June calendar, I know that we are a third of the way into June already, but we have packed June with fantastic events for readers of all ages. And now about tonight's book, The Hive. A story of survival, sisters, and secrets. The Failer sisters wanted to be more than bug girls, but growing up in a fourth-generation family pest control business in rural Missouri, their path was fixed. The family talked about Failer family exterminating at every meal, even when their mom said to separate the business from the family, an impossible task. They tried to escape work with trips to their trailer camp on the Mississippi River, but the sisters did more fighting than fishing. If only there was a son to lead rural Missouri insect control and guide the way through a crumbling patriarchy. After Robbie Failer's sudden death, the surprising details of succession in his will are revealed. He's left the company to a distant cousin, assuming the women of the family weren't capable. As the mother's long-term affair surfaces and her apocalypse prepper training intensifies, she wants to trade responsibility for romance. Facing an economic recession amidst the backdrop of growing Midwestern fear and resentment, the Failer sisters unite in their struggle to save the company's finances and the family's future. To survive, they must overcome a political chasm that threatens a new civil war as the values that once united them now divide the very foundation they built. Through alternating points of view, grief and regret gracefully give way to the enduring strength of the hive. Timothy Shaffert, the author of The Perfume Thief, says, I love books about sisters and I love The Hive, which has all the eccentricity and yearning of some of my favorite sister stories, like We Have Always Lived in the Castle by Shirley Jackson and Sisters by a River by Barbara Comans. From the very first chapter, The Hive is a deft, delightfully weird, and often comically family saga. And Alex George, the author of The Paris Hours and a dear friend, says The Hive by Melissa Scholes Young is real and raw, and will pin you back in your seat. It's a powerful portrait of a family coming to terms with a changing world that some are ready for and others are not. The Failer family is beautifully rendered in their messy complexity, flawed, tragic, and hopeful all at once. I loved it. And now about tonight's speakers. Melissa Scholes Young was born and raised in Hannibal, Missouri. She is the author of the novels Flood and The Hive. She's a contributing editor for Fiction Writers Review and editor of 2 volumes of DC women writers, Grace and Darkness and Furious Gravity. Her work has appeared in The Atlantic, Washington Post, Plowshares, Narrative, Poet Lore, and Poets and Writers magazine. Scholes Young was named a Breadloaf Camargo Fellow and a Quarry Farm Fellow at the Center for Mark Twain Studies. She is an associate professor in the Department of Literature at American University in Washington, D.C. And tonight, Melissa will be in conversation with Joy Castro. Joy is the award-winning author of the post-Katrina New Orleans literary thrillers Hell or High Water, which received the Nebraska Book Award and Nearer Home, and the story collection How Winter Began, as well as the memoir The Truth Book and the essay collection Island of Bones, which received the International Latino Book Award. She is also editor of the anthology Family Trouble and served as the guest judge of Craft's first Creative Nonfiction Award. Her work has appeared in the New York Times Magazine, Senses of Cinema, Salon, Plowshares, Gulf Coast, Brevity, Afro-Hispanic Review, and elsewhere. A former writer-in-residence at Vanderbilt University, she is currently the Willa Cather Professor of English and Ethnic Studies at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. And now, without further ado, if you would please help me in warmly welcoming Melissa Scholes Young and Joy Castro for Left Bank Books. Hello.
Hello. Thanks for having us. It's wonderful to be back in the Midwest, to be home again.
It's such a pleasure to have you this evening. I know that Chris, co-owner of Left Bank Books, is a huge fan of all of your work, Melissa, and we are so happy to be celebrating this book with you this evening.
Thank you. I'm a big fan
to have you.
I'm a big fan of Chris's as well, and I can't think of anyone I'd rather be in conversation with than you tonight, Joy.
Thank you so much. I'm thrilled. I'm really thrilled. I love this, and I want to toast. I want to congratulate you officially. Happy new book. It's fantastic, and I loved it. I loved your piece in Brevity, so clink.
Clink.
To you.
Thank you.
Yeah, so let's plunge in. I'm really excited about these questions. So for those who haven't read it, The Hive is a really thoughtful, complicated book that celebrates a family's ability to love each other across difference. It sympathetically explores the struggles of middle-class, white, working Americans in the Midwest through the eyes, as Shane said, of 4 sisters and their mother, who are left behind when the family patriarch suddenly dies. And the plot unfolds during a moment when the United States is transitioning from George W. Bush's presidency to Obama's. I love the novel's generous dialogic imagination. The chapters alternate among all 4 of the Feller sisters and their mother, Grace, and the characters have quite different points of view on a number of the political issues that continue to divide Americans today. So, given our own troubled political moment, can you tell us about how and why you chose your subject matter and your setting?
Right. Why would I step into this fraught conversation, especially at a time like now? Thank you for that. Thank you for that very thoughtful read, Joy. I always knew that this story had to be set in 2008. I knew I wanted to talk about the recession in Middle America, right? This growing fear, resentment, blaming of Obama, I think it very much laid a foundation for the election that we saw 8 years later. And some of the radicalism that we see today. Where I live on the East Coast, everyone was completely shocked by the election in 2016. And those of us, I think, who are from rural America and those of us who really traffic class weren't shocked at all. And so I knew that I wanted to dig into the questions that I had about living during this time. And Robbie, who's the patriarch and probably the most problematic, beloved and problematic member of the Hive, he longs for a past. And I heard that a lot in 2008 also, that this idea that it was better before, and
Yes.
that really there's this wrestling for power. And so Robbie's sudden death, I think, makes more room for the 5 women in the family to grow from that grief. Mm-hmm. But I also knew that this book would always be about small business in America, struggling through the recession, but also now that even more pertinent in 2021, having gone through the pandemic, right? Small businesses in our country are the backbone. 30 million small businesses. They account for 99.9% of our businesses, and these policies affect them, and the recession did as well. So I grew up in a small family business, a small family pest control business also in rural Missouri. And so that was territory that I was very familiar with.
For
So
sure.
it didn't feel quite as risky to jump into it because I feel as if I still in many ways live there and belong there as well.
Uh-huh, uh-huh. Well, I'm really intrigued by the way that the Hive, which focuses on the extermination company, works to undo common binaries. So, for example, honeybees, which we typically see as doing good, and provide the controlling metaphor for the title of the novel and the relationship among the family. Here they're shown to be dangerous and even potentially fatal, while bedbugs, a really serious pest, are revealed as sweet and may end up serving as the source of the family's future financial security. So I really loved this undoing of simple binaries. And at our political moment here and abroad, when some people do seem committed to quite literally exterminating the other, what do you think fiction can do to complicate simplistic narratives of enmity?
One of the things about bugs is that with the, they have to be in balance in the ecosystem as well. And so that fascinates me. And I think the Hive is a perfect read for the politically divided moment that we're actually in. And I hope that stories like this, I hope that what fiction can do is give us access to worlds that, we might not otherwise spend time in. Each of the fellow women have their own journey, and they have to learn about themselves through this sudden grief. But maybe it's easier to have some of these hard conversations around our own dinner table about fiction, right? It's easier to talk about characters perhaps than it is to talk about really our own personal lives. And I think many of the family disagreements in the business and in the fellow marriage intentionally mirror the debates that we're having as a country about healthcare and human rights. I think it's true that you inherit a place, you inherit a family, you inherit maybe your politics, maybe your religion, but it's also useful to question those things too. And I think to have an authentic portrait, you have to ask the questions and interrogate what you think you know and why.
Oh, that's wonderful. Yeah, yeah, that the novel can offer people a way in that could be a little safer.
I,
Um,
I hope so.
yeah, yeah. I have loved your speaking and your writing about class, like the piece in Brevity today. Fantastic. But I want to talk a little bit about sex and gender because I was really moved by the tenderness and the physical intimacies of the novel, particularly among the four sisters. And this begins right on the first page. Issues of sexuality, fertility, the body, and reproductive choice are incredibly important throughout the whole novel, from the mother Grace's rather surprising secret life to teenage Tammy's fertility dilemma to young Kate's exploration of early desire. I just loved this range. And so I wondered, can you tell us about the narrative opportunity of working with 5 female characters of different ages facing different physical and erotic dilemmas?
I'm always writing toward questions in my work. There are things I don't understand about the world or ways in which I'm poking something and I need to know more about it. And many of the ways that I wrote the parallel women in the book had to do with understanding really middle-aged female desire and how it's portrayed on the page, how it's written authentically, why we're uncomfortable talking about it. And I wanted it, we put labels on it, we put burdens on it that don't necessarily need to be there. And I wanted it not to be that complicated. I wanted it to be complicated only in how we justify talking about it or how Grace herself wrestles with it, that the desire itself isn't complicated. It's how she thinks it's supposed to be versus how it actually is that's complicated. So I'm fascinated by, how we justify not living our values and that fine line between productive guilt and shame. And I find that type of hypocrisy so ripe for stories.
Yes.
And part of, I think, Grace's motivation is also this, this apocalyptic prepping that is driving her, that motivates her as well. And I was trying to really get into Grace's shoes, understand how fear drove her and what she was willing to do because of that fear. So I went actually to Prepper Camp, which is a wilderness workshop in North Carolina, and to learn skill building, and wanted to really look at how the fear in Grace created a line between preparedness and paranoia. And I was surprised by what I found in the same ways I think we're often surprised by a female desire. I was very surprised by, I thought it would be a gun show. And Joy, it turned out to be more like a hippie camp. And the Feller family would fit in very well there. We were walking the forest and learning what we could eat. I learned about beekeeping. I learned about composting and solar energy. And Grace is that kind of survivalist, right? And she actually sees the affair as a way to help protect her family, that it will strengthen the hive by having someone else that brings another skill set into the hive. So she justifies the decisions that she's making by what's best for her actual family. And Grace, like, you know, the bugs I mentioned earlier, she wants to live in conjunction with the land. And so it serves her to actually protect it. But when she crosses that line and considers sort of dehumanizing others because she disagrees with them, it's a pretty dangerous line. And she gets very close to that precipice, I think. She's a fierce mother. She'll protect her family. But she has to face and to fix herself, I think, before she can devote those energies to the hive. So it's complicated with Grace, and I'm always writing complicated female characters.
Yes, she is really complicated. It's funny because she gets some of the best insights and the funniest lines in the whole novel. I think she's a really fascinating character. I don't think I mentioned to you that my prepper mother used to read Yule Gibbons and feed us dandelion greens and cattails and stuff like this because she was sure the end of the world was coming, but that's a conversation for another time.
No, but I actually love that because many of the fears actually sound, you know, of the apocalypse sound pretty extreme, but prepperism has become pretty mainstream, right? Some of the fears have actually come true, and some of the things that preppers are preparing for, you know, climate change and natural disasters, those are not actually crazy ideas. Those are things that are actually happening now. And dandelion greens are delicious.
Cattails less so. The failure of the grid in Texas and so on. I mean, these are really having an effect on people's lives in very immediate ways, and they're questioning, well, how safe can, you know, the government, the social safety net, how safe can it really keep me, and what do I need to learn to do for myself?
And especially coming, you know, in a pandemic,
Yes.
when we've seen some failure of those institutions, I understand that desire and the need to take care of yourself. That makes a lot of sense to me. And I was raised, you know, in the country in rural Missouri, and that's what I learned to do, is to do on my own. And so that's actually served me well in the writing life, because you know, Joy, how many hours we have to spend alone taking care of our books, wrestling with plot, that it's really about self-sustaining, you know, your story. And so I think that type of work ethic has served me well as a writer. Too.
Yeah, writer as prepper.
We're always preparing.
Yes. Well, let me ask you another question about the book. You've alluded to Little Women, and the book references Little Women explicitly, and Mark Twain's Huckleberry Finn explicitly, and it's really delightful. While I was reading, I also kept thinking about Jane Austen, and particularly Sense and Sensibility and Pride and Prejudice, mainly because of the plot structure aspect in which male heirs dispossess the heroines simply because of gender and law, and the women are left with marriage as their only route to economic security. So in the Hive, the Feller girl's cousin, Brian, is a historian, and he inherits a share of the family extermination business, although he's clearly not cut out to be a bug guy. And so I was really interested in the ways that you evoke and yet resist the marriage plot in the book. And I wanted to know if you could tell us a little bit about how deliberately you were riffing on Austen, or if you were just addressing the economic sexism that persists today.
Brian was a lot of fun to write because he's not just a historian, but he's actually a scholar of Twain's mother, of Jane Clemens. And I know so many things about Jane Clemens because I too got in my research, really obsessed with her. So what we're really trying to do in our novels is figure out how to get all the stuff that we know and what our actual curiosities are into the book. So it was really fun to have Brian be that historian. And Brian, I think, as you said, Joy, really complicates the story in a nice way. I did have Austen in mind. I want very much in my work to retell classic stories through a modern lens that my own daughters can read and that I, as a young woman, would have appreciated. In my first book, Flood, I was reimagining Tom and Huck's famous friendship as female, really asking the kind of, trying to write the kind of characters that I wished I had been raised with. And I think that feminism and that resistance is implicit in the classics in characters, but of course they're limited in the time period that they're in by the laws, as you mentioned. And I want to make it explicit so that we can move beyond the questions about economic sexism. And we can't fix what we don't recognize or what we don't really want to talk about. Brian, like Robbie, he's also a first generation college student, and he's always had this complicated love for Robbie. And when Robbie dies in the first part of the story, it creates, I think, a space for the family to reorganize their structure. And Brian impacts that reorganization. In patriarchal families, we usually have a son, and he's essential to carry on the family line. But since the Fellers have 4 daughters, Brian is forced into that role by Robbie rewriting his will before his death. But Brian doesn't. Brian, to me, he wants a place in the Hive, but he doesn't want to necessarily dominate it. And I think that opens up the family system and complicates, what you mentioned, Joy, about the marriage plot in a much more interesting way.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's cool. I'm wondering about the issues of point of view and the way that only the women do get their chapters, right? So Robbie doesn't have a chapter, Brian doesn't have a chapter. So for the writers in the audience, let me ask a follow-up question about dialogism and craft. So for me, one of the most striking aspects of the book and one of its great successes is the way that it balances all 5 characters' perspectives, all the Feller women. And I'm sure you thought through the first person versus third person decision. So I wonder if you could talk about what led you to choose a close third person point of view for the different characters' chapters rather than creating 5 different first person point of view voices. And then did you find yourself altering the style of the third person narration for the different characters, or did you try to stick with a consistent style throughout the novel?
This is such a great craft question because it really forces me to pull back the lens, ask myself why I did, what I did and why I made it so very complicated in the process so that it worked on the page. I spent a lot of time wrestling with point of view, writing scenes from different point of views, trying to figure out whose story it actually is. And so each of the 5 Feller women have a distinct style, right? But the narrator is consistent throughout the novel. So it's the narrator really that is the same voice that holds it all together. In revision, once I had the plot stable, I actually rewrote each character from beginning to end separately. So it took I know. It took about a month for each of them, but it created consistency in the voice. It did mean that I sort of wrote 5 novels, which I don't recommend. But for each plot move, I had to decide then whose story it was to tell at that exact moment. And this often meant writing a scene from a different voice to learn who had the access that we needed for the arc in that actual moment. Then I decided that the Hive was also going to follow 12 months, which is 4 Midwestern seasons and all of the holy holidays in a Catholic calendar. So each had to interact with the story for the structure to hold. So a lot of spreadsheets is what I'm saying. Very many plot spreadsheets for point of view too. And the prologue and the epilogue are actually told only by the narrator rather than close third to any one of the Feller women. And each of those scenes has to occur with just the sisters on the same dock 1 year apart. So, like I said, a lot of spreadsheets to hold it together, but I never wrote Robbie's point of view and I never wrote Brian's point of view either. I knew from the beginning that this was going to be a story in which they had a huge impact, but that the story was really going to be about these women.
That's wonderful. Is there anything else that you can tell us about your writing process? I know writers and readers alike are always fascinated.
Oh, what else can I tell you? I tend to write in bursts, right? I tend to write during some seasons, and then I will not write during others. I work on essays during the school year when, like you, Joy, I'm teaching and I don't have quite the same space. I tend to write a full draft during the summer. And once I'm in a story, I have to stay in the story until I get a full draft, or it's complicated for me to come in and out. I usually write point of view wrong before I figure out how to get it right. And I learn a lot about my stories by changing point of views, writing them wrong, like I said, in order to figure them out, but sometimes even writing them in different genres. Because I was raised in a rural family pest control business, I wrote a lot of essays that now accompany the work, but where I was trying to sort out my story. And that was a big part of the writing process of the Hive too, but this isn't my family's story. My father is still fishing off a dock, and I have brothers, and they run the family business. And so our family story is very different than this one. But many of the questions remain, and I'm always led by the questions in my writing process. I usually have to have at least 3 questions in mind in order to start a new project. And it takes me a lot of time. Yeah, a lot of time to do the thinking part. I think we dismiss the thinking part of novel writing. I'm always thinking about my characters and my stories. And I'm always writing down snippets of dialogue that I hear, and my family is always cautioning me when they say something that I should not use, and they'll hold up their hands. They don't write that down. Do not write that down. But there's so many gifts, I think, from life when we're really paying attention.
Well, I'm kind of fascinated by the notion of writing into questions. I encourage nonfiction writers to do that all the time, which surprises students because they feel like they have to know the answers to be able to write, and not at all. If you write into the questions, you discover what you do know. So I'm curious, are you willing to tell us what the 3 animating questions were that drove you through the Hive?
Oh, that's a great. Can I remember them now? I know what the 3 are in the next book.
Can you tell us those? Do you want to keep those a secret for now?
I think I'm still sorting through those, and I'm actually very. I can tell a little bit about the next project, but I'm actually, until I get 50,000 words, maybe 100,000 words, I really don't share a lot of my work, and I don't know if this is the same for you, Joy, but I don't seek a lot of feedback until I know what I'm doing.
Yeah.
And that requires a lot of patience because we want feedback, right? We're writers in the world, and we want to hear from readers. It's an honor to have readers. So with the Hive, I was definitely looking at what would happen if there weren't a male heir, right? Like what would happen if we had 4 women in a family in which the business had been passed along through men. But I was looking at also that line. What's the line between paranoia and preparedness? That definitely drove a great deal of the questions. But then I had questions for each of the sisters as well, because they go on such different journeys to try to, and they change so much. I mean, a year with this type of really devastating sudden grief really alters a person. There is a before Robbie, when Robbie lived, and then there's an after for every single person in this family. And I was fascinated and devastated on their behalf. I think to write characters and to write toward those answers, you have to have, at least for me, I have to have a lot of curiosity. I try to approach them with a lot of compassion, even when I disagree with their choices. I write pretty flawed characters that make mistakes. Those are the people I love in my life best, are the ones that, take big risks, and sometimes they pay off and sometimes they don't. But I think, like you, I think that empathy has to be a writer's really superpower. And if we're not approaching, our characters and our subject that way, it won't read compelling. And that's a lot of work, right? It's a lot of personal work, actually, as a writer to go through to be able to access that in characters as well.
Yes, I definitely agree. And I would say that spirit of generosity and curiosity and compassion infuses every page of this novel. It's beautiful. Would you be willing to read a little bit for us?
Sure.
And let me just Go ahead.
No, please. I would be happy to. Do you want me to read, Joy, from the beginning? Does that make sense?
I think so. That would whet the audience's appetite. And let me just remind the audience to drop questions in the comments section, and we'll get to them in 5 minutes or so. But yes, please read.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much. I'm going to read to you from the beginning. So this will bring the family in, and you'll get to meet each of the sisters as well. It was mid-July on a sweltering Missouri afternoon, and the sun couldn't find a single cloud to hide behind. Waterfowl ducked beneath the river surface, and whippoorwills sang their melancholy from lush trees waving above. The stale air stank of soil and algae mixed with coconut sunscreen. The muddy water of the Mississippi River wasn't worried with the Feller family's survival, but the sisters were. Sunshine baked the wooden dock and kissed the Feller sisters' freckles. Just as they had the summer before, and the one before that one too, the sisters wore bikinis. Faded tops and bottoms passed down and among them. The river assaulted the elastic, and the blistering light faded the floral colors, but still, camp swimwear endured. It came too close for me, Tammy said, dangling her legs off the dock. We almost lost everything. She flexed her feet in the sticky air. A rotten piece of debris hung from her pinky toe. Tammy shook it off, and the current swept it away. Everything that mattered anyway. It was never that close, Maggie insisted. She swatted a mosquito on Tammy's thigh, leaving a thin trail of crimson bug blood. Besides, nobody would want this old fishing camp. It's a mess. But it's our mess, Kate said, looking up and down her row of sisters. It was too close for Mom, Jules added. She was itching to be done with it all. The family business and the business of the family, all of it. At least we're still together, Maggie said. That's what Dad cared about. Sipping green glass bottles of soda, the sisters agreed, but they'd never know the true feelings of their father. 1 year ago, they'd sat on this same dock, months before their family broke, and they were left with only the fragments of the whole they'd once been. Now they were making their first camp trip solo as sisters. They were still sorting out who brought what and how the family worked now. Jules dove into the brown water alone and waded her way back up. Maggie and Tammy held hands, nudging each other's hips, and jumped off the dock together. Kate ran at her sisters, waited in vain for her parents to call after them, and then belly flopped in the middle of their wake with a splash. The Feller family fish camp had been handed down for 3 generations, a burden both beloved and neglected. It was a simple single-wide trailer on stilts, with rusted panels that had maybe once been painted white. The camp sat at the meeting of the mighty Mississippi and the Ohio River on the lap of Fort Defiance Park. Robbie, their dad, liked to remind them all that it was once called Camp Defiance during the Civil War and had been commanded by General Ulysses S. Grant. Jules would roll her eyes and tell him that glorifying a war fought for slavery was oppressive. And before they began bantering about erasing history versus righting historical wrongs, Grace, their mother, would hold up her hand and say, "Enough." By the time they loaded the car for these trips, Grace had made dozens of decisions. She sought a truce, even if it wouldn't hold. The trailer's living room and kitchen combination reeked of rancid catfish and bitter beer. The 2 miniature bedrooms housed 4 sets of built-in bunks, with narrow strips of peeling, dingy vinyl between the lofts. The Fellers ran to camp most summer weekends and squeezed in a few fall trips before the chill arrived and the leaves crisped in the Missouri Valley. At camp, the sisters learned to bait hooks, pull fish traps from the muck, and dig burrs out of their bare feet. They knew which bunks were theirs because they'd carved their names in the frames as a tradition on their 5th birthday. On their annual inaugural trip, as spring rounded the corner to summer, Grace cut notches in the wooden stairs to measure her daughter's growth. She added their initials and the date while the sisters raced ahead, peeling off Catholic school uniforms and pulling on mismatched swimsuit pieces from a communal wicker basket before jumping off the dock into the cool relief of the muddy water. The family dog chased them, cautioning their courage with a bark and cheering on their unleashed animal freedom. The promise of the camp brought hope. It lifted the family's spirits to pile in the car after the last day of school and travel toward the water. Each trip, the Feller family wished they would roast marshmallows for s'mores and finally catch fireflies without fighting over which sister had more. They would leave the family pest control business behind and not talk about how to cover the quarterly tax bill or whether they should pay for their employees' cell phones. But first, they had to drive the 46 miles from Cape Girardeau, Missouri, to Cairo, Illinois, snaking the Mississippi River's gritty coast to put in the boat. Each trip, Robbie insisted they coordinate bathroom breaks for the drive, but they had to stop at least twice. Even as they grew from children to teens to young adults, their trips were the same. Maggie would say they should have checked the road conditions. Jules got carsick. Someone else would say planning took away from the adventure, probably Tammy. Kate didn't say much. She was lost in her own thoughts and passed around their mom's latest creation of homemade granola bars. Their brindle pit bull Nacho would rind from the back seat and lick their hands for crumbs. Robbie promised that if they could all just hold it, they'd be cooking hot dogs over a fire in time for supper, but they usually settled for grilled cheese sandwiches on the dock as the sun set. Nacho ran after the bunnies in the bushes, hoping to find his own dinner, relieved to be released from the car. Who knew which family camp trip would be the one they'd remember most? The pieces of the weekends and years might add up to an entirely different story. Maybe they'd each remember separate parts, or the same ones in different patterns. Perhaps as grief and joy intersected, they'd learn that the whole mattered more than the portions. Nacho could have told them that. Dogs know that the only moment that matters is the one you're living.
That's gorgeous. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Joy. That's so kind. Thank you, thank you.
Beautiful.
That was really beautiful.
Thank you, Shane. Y'all are nice. When people write books, y'all are nice to them. I like that.
All right. Are we ready for audience Q&A? All right. So I want to start with one of my questions while the audience types up. We have a couple of comments over here, but I want the audience to start thinking of what you are most wanting to have answered. And so, Melissa, we are both from, I guess rural Missouri. Like Hannibal's not really like super duper rural in terms of like what you might think of like rural Missouri. But I'm from a similarly like kind of countryside town in Missouri.
But I'm surprised you say it Missouri. I've always said Missouri.
Oh,
like
no.
2 syllables, Missouri, right? Isn't that how you actually say it? I'm confused.
I'm from Maryville, which is like it's like Iowa.
It's Maryville. I know Maryville. And I have to admit also, Hannibal was going into town for us. Our land is actually out in New London, which is 1,000 people, good people.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's definitely rural.
So since both of your books have been set in Missouri, I'm wondering, like, stranger than fiction. Have you had anything that you have included in a book that the copyright or the copy editor said, like, oh, this doesn't, like, there's no way that this could happen, that you know for a fact, like, has similarly happened? Or were there things that you yourself were like, I just can't, like, no one would believe this if I put it in the book?
I feel like one of my 27 first cousins called you, Shane, and set you up with this question. Because we had some dilemmas with the copy editor for my first book. They hired an NYU historian, a Twain scholar, who was fantastic for the first book. And they were pleased to report that the Twain scholarship was well done. I hadn't messed in any dangerous ways with that sacred territory. But there was the name of a road, which we call Route O, which is out near my grandma's house. And apparently it doesn't actually exist on any maps. And I know it does. And all of my cousins agreed. And it was something I actually fought for, because I think we know our land better. And so that was probably a good example of something I actually knew, but that didn't actually hold up. It doesn't actually exist, except it does. I can actually drive you out there and show you the sign for it. But that's a really great question. I think most people are actually surprised in this novel that prepper camp is a real thing. That I didn't make that up, that I actually went to it, and that these type of survivalist training camps occur all over our country, all over the world. Actually, there's something like 15 million preppers in our country right now, and there's 20 million preppers in the world. It's become less fringe and actually very mainstream. And I think that surprises people. But most of the stuff that's true in my novels is actually not made up. So fiction's a lot of fun. In many ways, I think it has to be more true than nonfiction.
Yeah. I mean, I just love the stranger than fiction tales from authors. Like they're, they're frequently like things like the road where they're just like, no, like this is actually something that I pulled from real life. Like it exists.
I will drive you. I will drive you out on the road and show you. um, but I'm sure there's plenty of things like that that people think, are made up, but actually are true. I don't pull anything from my own life without permission. That I think is important to do when you're borrowing
Yeah.
stories that are authentic and true. The goal is not to do any harm.
So we have a comment from Eileen that I'm going to morph into adding a question on there as well. But Eileen says, I'm really looking forward to reading your book. I find myself drawn to stories that delve into family dynamics and relationships, especially when the reader is aware of the cultural, geographic, and political times in which the family members have lived / are living. And the question that I'm going to tack onto that beautiful comment is, have you found any books recently, or maybe not recently, that really have connected in some way to you about the family dynamics and relationships? It could even be abstractly, but I feel like that is such a very special thing when you find it in fiction,
Mm-hmm.
that it really pulls you in as a reader.
Mm-hmm. That's a really thoughtful question. And I need a minute to think about it. So I'm going to go backward, Shane, because I just remembered in my first book, the Tom and Becky contest, which we have in Hannibal. Have you heard of this, Shane?
Where people dress like...
No, people compete to be the official Tom and Becky in my town. And it is such a huge honor. It's this really amazing program, and everyone thought I was making that up in my first book, and it's real. I mean, I would have loved to be Becky Thatcher. I was definitely not Becky Thatcher material, but that's the kind of thing that people think is fictional, and it's very much not. You can come for 4th of July and see the new Tom and the new Becky Thatcher, and I'm hoping one day we have an actual Huck and a Jim as well. But I want to get back to Eileen's question because it was so very thoughtful. And I think she might be asking for like recommendations, like books that...
Well, I tacked on the question. Yeah. Eileen was just saying how much your kind of books relate with the family dynamics and relationships and how much that it connects with readers. So I was wondering if you have those books. And Joy, this could be something that maybe you might have an answer to as well. I can start by answering if you want more time.
No, it's a great question. One of the novels that I think, there's two I think of off the top of my head that I hope my work is very much in conversation with. One is a novel called Silver Girl by Leslie Petrick, and it's set outside of Chicago, and it traffics in familiar territories about feminism from rural roots and also first-gen college experiences, which Joy and I both write and have experienced. That I recommend. I also really hope, because I'm such a big fan of Elizabeth Strout's work, I love Olive Kittredge is actually my favorite fictional character, maybe ever. I love ambivalent mothers. I especially love when women don't behave the way that they are supposed to, when they aren't necessarily, good girls, and because they're being true to themselves. And I love watching the town in Olive Kittredge react to Olive. But I have to say also, and this is not just product placement, but I think these essays by Joy are some of the most beautiful family stories. And when I read these essays, wait a minute, I have another recommendation. And these are up on the Left Bank website as well. Family Trouble is what I'm reading right now, because my next project is narrative nonfiction, and I'm really wrestling with feminist working class coming of age stories in Middle America. And Joy's book, Memoirs on the Hazards and Rewards of Revealing Family, is exactly the answer that I'm looking for right now. How do you tell authentic stories and really remain true to your own self, but also protect and love the people that raised you and honor them? I swear, Joy, that was not just product placement. I'm a big fan.
It's really like convenient though. Like it was just right there.
You're in my office.
Well, I mean, this does raise a question for me about the way that you toggle back and forth between fiction and nonfiction with a lot of respect for the privacy of the people whose stories you're drawing upon. I wonder if you could talk about that. I mean, I think you draw these really immaculate ethical lines for yourself as a writer, which are hard to draw, which is why I ended up editing that collection, Family Trouble, because I was fascinated by how different writers do this. And those are 25 different writers, and they all do it differently. So I wonder if you want to talk about that in terms of your own fiction and nonfiction.
I think it's important in nonfiction to remember that the story that you're telling is always just one version of that story, right?
Yeah.
If you all have siblings, if you ask them what happened in that one memory that you all have, every single person has a different version of it. And the thing to me that's fascinating is they are all true versions, right? There isn't one way it actually was, because we are all, and it's the same thing with readers, we are all bringing something very different to the page. And so how we're experiencing an essay, how we're experiencing a scene, has a lot more to do with our own baggage that we're bringing into the reading experience. I've had readers tell me things about my novels that I did not see, did not intend. I'm not sure exactly they were there, but that is the true experience for them as a reader, because they're bringing in, their own selves to it. And I think that's when stories really come alive, is when they get in the hands of a reader, and a reader feels entitled, right, to the story, entitled to the character. I have a lot of readers who want to talk to me about my characters as if they're completely real people. And of course they are, right? I've created a world that I hope is more real. But I think it's always a balancing act to figure out what is my truth, because my truth is always changing too, right? So what's my truth versus what's the larger story that I want to tell? For me as a nonfiction writer, what's always useful is to pan out, to tell a narrative story, but then also say, what's this story really about? So it's not just about my experience watching an eclipse. It's actually about fear. It's actually about control. It's actually about, a very, very different, larger topic that is always more interesting, I think, than my own experience.
In regard to that issue of readers getting really attached to a character or even feeling entitled to a character, I was curious about our 5 main characters in the Hive. And as a thought experiment, if you had to choose one of them and write a sequel about her, can you tell us who that would be, and maybe when you would set the sequel? Or
that's a great thought experiment. And I'm working on another novel simultaneously, and I'm interested in how some characters from my first novel, which show up in the Hive too, are showing up in my third book. So minor characters becoming major characters. It's very possible that that's actually what I write. And because those characters are still knocking on my door, right? They still have more things to say. I suspect that Grace is probably the character if I were going to write a sequel. But the truth is, I'm actually rooting for Maggie the most. Right? I do. I very much see that she is the one who has the power to change the trajectory of the whole family. And so I'm rooting for her success. And I think it would be interesting because Maggie is at that really ripe coming of age moment, right? In her own personal life, but also she is a very young woman to have suddenly inherited the entire helm of this family business. That's a huge responsibility. So I don't know. I'm rooting for her.
That's fantastic.
Who do you want me to write, Joy?
I really love Jules, and I thought that her dilemmas were so fascinating. But in a way, these are more familiar to me, right? And the notion of another whole novel devoted to Maggie and her challenges, what things look like for her 10 years later, would be so compelling and fascinating, because as you say, she's sort of on the cusp of the potential for really radical change. And she's like on the verge of her own power.
one of the things I like about having minor characters that keep coming back as major characters, and Maggie is certainly a major character in this, but there are some other characters that show up. The protagonist, who I think is also an antagonist of my first novel, Laura Brooks, actually is the ER nurse in this novel. And it's a big surprise. I will hear from readers who say, oh, there she is. And it's a fun thing to do, is to kind of give little Easter eggs. But I don't really think my work are like sequels. Like, you don't have to read them in a certain order. But these characters are in conversation, I think, with each other.
Yeah, yeah.
We do have a comment. So Chris, the co-owner of Left Bank Books, says, love, love, love this conversation as I navigate writing about my own family. Thank you. And I wanted to ask a question about something that you said two answers ago. I'm wondering what you mentioned truth in nonfiction. And I'm wondering if you find it easier or harder to do truth in fiction or truth in nonfiction, because they both kind of mean a lot of different things. But for a writer, I'm wondering what challenges you more.
So the professor in me, Shane, wants you to tell me how you define truth.
Nope. Oh, no. I think that in nonfiction, like, truth can mean a lot. It can mean, like, literally, like, are these facts that I can find? Is this a conceived truth, or is this like something that, like, is? And I find in narrative nonfiction, memoir, like, the perceived truth is sometimes very difficult to say, like, no, like, this did happen, this happened in this way, this is how I saw it, whether or not other people saw it the same way, like, this is my truth. And truth in fiction for me is a lot of, like, being true to the characters. So once you have this idea of who a character is, I feel like there are, like, really fantastic authors stay very true to who the character is. Even when they do something that is out of character, it shocks them and surprises the other characters on the page. So I feel like there is a truth that even a fictional character can have in a similar way, their perceived truth.
It sounds to me like in nonfiction specifically, you're talking about the difference between memory and truth. And memory, I think, is always unreliable and fascinating because we're actually always retelling our memories, right? This is, I think, part of why it's so important to give children pictures, is that we're telling a story about their lives. And by doing so, we actually frame their experiences. And I think it's really useful when you're dealing with memory in nonfiction to acknowledge when the memory is contested, right? And I think that's also a really generous way of acknowledging that other people in your story have, disagree with you, have a different experience, and it doesn't make your truth less to say, this is how I remembered it, but my uncle completely disagrees and says that never happened. I think that's also a way of having intimacy with the reader, to acknowledge the fallibility of memory. Joy, you're nodding along.
Oh, I just love that. I love everything that you say. And it reminded me of this, what Alison Hedgecock does when she's writing memoir. She actually, I know some memoirs wouldn't get written if this happened, but she actually shares the manuscript drafts with her parents and her adult son. And when they disagree, she invites them to share their account of a moment. And then she folds that into the text and says, here's how I remember it. And then here's how my adult son remembers it. The memory is contested, but I want to be intimate with you, the reader, fallible, and share this with you. So I was nodding because I love what you're saying. Yeah.
I think it actually creates more trust with the reader when you're willing to invite them into it, but also admit that we all have versions of the truth, and they may all be true, right? They may even be contested, but it doesn't mean that that both can't be true. I certainly do that with my novels. I give them to trusted friends, well, I gave this novel specifically to my parents and said, is there anything that's too close, right? Is there anything that we need to change, take out, anything I've borrowed that I didn't have permission to do? It's important to me. And I can imagine doing that with the project I'm working on now, the narrative nonfiction. I find myself in the writing of it anytime I feel like I'm getting too close to something that I'm not sure I'm ready to share. I'm finding myself going to research, right? Like, okay, so I have this story, but I don't know yet how close I want to get to it. But again, what's the bigger story about? And how can I use research to give myself a larger lens?
Yeah.
Yeah. But I'm figuring this out too.
We have 2 questions that just came in. So let's, if you're okay, I think this will take us over time, but I would like to explore both of these questions if you both are okay with going over.
I'm great, Shane. Happy to be here.
So question from Joe. What makes Missouri a unique setting for this book? If it were set somewhere else in the Midwest or some other rural location, would it be the same?
I grew up on the riverbank, and many of us in Missouri know what it's like to live in a floodplain, to constantly be keeping your eye on the Mississippi River. And so I don't know. I'm sure that there are other struggles, in our country. And I think of your novels, Joy, set in New Orleans. I think of that also watching water. So I'm sure it could be set other places, but that's a struggle that I'm very familiar with. And when I think of rivers and lakes and streams and the natural world, I always think of the beauty of Missouri. I now live in a part of Maryland that surprisingly looks a great deal like Missouri, and I've been pleasantly surprised that it feels so very familiar and it feels comfortable to me to have rolling hills. So I don't think it could be set anyplace else than Missouri, but mostly because I feel that I understand the people, right? And I want to respect and honor and also write from those roots. So I think you could tell these stories in another place, but probably by a different author. Do you feel that way too, Joy, about your geography?
Yes. Typically, no matter where I set it, I always think it has to be there, or I wouldn't set it there. Yeah. Yes, absolutely.
I'll share the comment by Eileen in reference to your answer, and then we will conclude with Jen's question. Eileen says, Ann Patchett once said in a Left Bank Books event that she avoided making families the center of her novels because of concern with how her family members might perceive the characters. So she talked to her siblings and they said, go for it. No secrets here.
That's generous. That's very generous.
All right, so Jen says, hi, Melissa. The 4 sisters are each so dynamic, and I'm interested in learning more about your process when developing these complex characters.
It is long and laborious as well. As I mentioned, the work that I do in Point of View, I have a different journal for each of the characters, and I spend a lot of time getting to know them. Some of my morning pages are just me writing down things about the character that may or may not actually ever make it on the page, but that I feel as the writer I need to know in order to inhabit them and to write dialogue that sounds authentically like only Tammy would say this in the book, right? Only Kate would think this in the book. So I know their favorite colors. I know their favorite desserts. I know all their secrets. I know the lies that they tell. I know their deepest desires. I know what embarrasses them, the most embarrassing moments. I know so much about them, but it may not actually make it into the book. So I spend a lot of time really imagining complete and full lives for my characters and really approaching them with curiosity. And that takes a lot of time, but it also makes the writing of them, I think, more authentic on the page so that they're really distinct voices. It's hard to hold 5 different point of views and make sure that a reader can follow and know when we're switching between them.
I think that back work is so effective in the Hive, and the depth and the texture of each of the characters is so fully realized that, as a reader, even though I'm juggling all these different characters, I'm never confused. I never think, oh, Maggie could have been Tammy or anything like that. No, even though they're very close to each other, they're very distinct as individuals. So that hard work really pays off.
I think readers would be surprised by how much is left on the floor.
Yes.
That to write a book and have it published that's 300 pages, I probably wrote 1,000. And I'm not precious about those pages. They were not all good pages. And so when you're revising, it's okay to trust that better and more work will always come.
Yes. How do you cultivate that trust in yourself?
I think I've written enough wrong. And I also, I write what burns. I write what, right now I'm working on a novel at the same time that I'm working on the narrative nonfiction, but it's really the narrative nonfiction that I'm writing and I'm publishing and surprisingly getting so much more feedback on. Joy, you mentioned the piece I published today at Brevity, and that was a joy, but really a risk for me to write about class. And I wrote another piece for Lit Hub about my own family's business. And again, it came out of that place of what the story that I want to most tell right now, and why this is such an important moment in our country to talk about class, and also for publishing houses to pay attention to ways in which class is being consumed, and I mean consumed as in the stories that we're telling about class, and why readers are so very hungry. And also for, I hope, the Academy to pay more attention to stories that are about class, because we're lacking a great amount of scholarship on rural literature, but also stories that traffic in class.
And I would say that the Hive really delves into the intersection of race and class too. I mean, you're interrogating whiteness in this book as well, in very explicit ways, particularly with Jules and her relationship. But just throughout, the interrogation of whiteness, I think, is terribly important right now as well.
I agree, and I don't think we can talk about anything without talking about all of these different intersectionalities.
At once.
Yeah, I don't think you actually can separate those identities, because each of them make a part, of the whole a character becomes.
And did you say a minute ago, I write what burns?
I did say that.
Because that's definitely a quotable quote right there. I write what burns. Yeah, that's beautiful.
Oh, I'm always telling my students that too, because they'll say, well, I'm working on this, but what I'm really thinking about, and that's that you just drop everything else. You just write what it is that burns, because it won't come back. Or you might write down a version of it now. I find this happening in my work. I will write down a version of something I'm interested in, and then 8 years later, it will come back in another way. So many of, I started writing the idea of Bug Girls a decade ago, easily a decade ago. And yet it's my second novel. So I think the work sometimes requires more time to marinate in my own mind before it comes out in the form that I want to tell that story most in.
Oh, fascinating.
I really like cheating on my books with each other. There's this picture I found recently. I'm on my way to Left Bank Books. I'm meeting my family for dinner. And I'm on my way to Left Bank for the launch of my first novel, which I held at Left Bank Books. One of my absolute favorite memories of book tour ever. And I'm going, and there's a napkin in the picture beside me at my place setting. And on it, I have written, if I panned into it, it says, Grace, is she a prepper? And I realized I was already writing this novel when I was, in hotel rooms on my first book tour. And I like sort of that secrecy.
Yes.
The way that I'm talking about one book, but I'm actually writing another. It keeps me curious, and it really feels like I'm holding something that's my own while I am out in the world talking about my book with readers and giving it to them as well.
Phenomenal.
Yeah, thank you both. That tonight has been really beautiful. So many quotes. So I hope that someone at home is writing down all of the incredible wisdom that you both have given the world tonight, because you've been so giving in this event. I have shared the link again on audience. You can click on that link to go and find both of Melissa's books and also some of Joy's books available at Left Bank Books. You can order those together. Be sure to be thinking of who you can give this book to, because as you were speaking, I was like, I know exactly who I want to give your book to. Yeah, I'm really excited to get your book into more people's hands. So happy to be celebrating the release of this book with you, and I wish you all the best.
Thank you, Shane. Thank you, Joy. And thank you to everyone for coming. And thank you to Chris. I can't wait to read your book too, Chris.
And audience, we will see you next time. Thank you for joining us, and I hope you have a fantastic rest of your evening. Have a good night,
Bye, everyone.
everyone.
Bye. Thank you.